All right, good afternoon, everyone. We will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the current webinar series, the North Central Region Water Network Speed Networking webinar series. Very excited to join you today and to be talking about new and expanded funding opportunities. There is a lot of opportunity and promise when it comes to water and natural infrastructure. So excited to explore that a little bit more and hear from two folks who are experts and know what they're talking about when it comes to what we as water professionals should know about these funding opportunities coming down the pipeline here. For those of you who don't know us, the North Central Region Water Network is a 12-state extension-led partnership. We are dedicated to ensuring safe and sufficient water supplies and stewarding water resources by leveraging resources and programming across institutions. We host this webinar on a monthly basis, and each time we feature a different water-related topic. We are in our 9th year, closely approaching our 10th anniversary here. And we this month are going to be featuring new and expanding funding opportunities around water. A couple housekeeping items for you before we dive into our speakers. We will have a dedicated Q&A portion for the webinar today after we hear from both of our speakers. So please put your questions in the Q&A panel as they come up. The Q&A panel can be found at the bottom of your screen. And we will take those questions as they come and try to get to as many as we have time for following both presentations. There is an option to upvote someone else's questions, so make sure to read the questions that are already there. If there's something that's similar to a question you have, you can upvote that because we will take those questions that are most popular, most upvoted first. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, feel free to let us know in the chat. We have the chat really open for those technical issues. We can try to address those, or if you'd like to introduce yourself to others on the call today, or we have that for sharing resources and links. That's really what the chat is for, whereas the Q&A is really where we address the speaker questions. If you are having any issues with audio, you can call in today. That can be accessed by clicking the up arrow on the mute icon and then clicking switch to phone. This will be recorded and we will post that recording on our website, northcentralwater.org. It'll be on our homepage probably sometime in the next 24 hours or so. All right, that's all the housekeeping today. So let's dive in. We have two great presenters for you. Becca Truman with Quantified Ventures is going to be talking about clean water state revolving funds. And opportunities for those in terms of expanded funding and expanding that. We know that with the bipartisan infrastructure law, quite a bit of funding has been expanded for that in terms of water infrastructure. So thinking about that in terms of nature-based solutions. And then we have Jesse Womack from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, really talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. What that means for expanded funding for many of the conservation agricultural programs, as well as changes that might be coming up for the next Farm Bill. So our first speaker today is Becca Truman. She is with Quantified Ventures. I'd mentioned that before. I won't read her full bio here, but we're very excited to have Becca here to talk a little bit about the state revolving funds and how that can impact our work as water educators, how we can better utilize some of those opportunities moving forward. So I'll stop sharing and hand it off to you, Becca.
Great, thanks, Anne-Marie. Let me just get my presentation up and let me know if you're having trouble seeing anything or hearing me. All right, and I'm going to get started. Perfect. All right, so thanks again for letting me join you all today. It's so great to be with you. I'm going to be discussing opportunities for nature-based solutions with the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So I'll quickly start by saying that this presentation is going to be taking a higher level view on state revolving funds because every state is different, every situation is different, especially when discussing non-traditional projects where there likely may not even be an example yet to refer to. This is also geared towards those doing non-point source work, which I think is most of you here today. And just so you know, I'm speaking to you as if I was speaking to myself in my former position where I was working locally on the ground, managing 319 grants, and kind of what would I have wanted to know back in that position. So I hope the next few minutes gives you just enough to get the wheels spinning if they're not already, and to start seeing state revolving funds as a real option for your community. 5 reasons why those doing non-point source work should care about state revolving funds. Number 1, this is a reliable source of funding. So state revolving funds, they've been around for over 30 years, expected to be around indefinitely. The federal government allocates funds to be added every single year, and the revolving mechanism of these funds creates inherent sustainability. Number 2, building resilience and disaster recovery. So we're all experiencing an increasing need in our communities to build resilience. Unfortunately, the push to take action often comes from experiencing a disaster, but there's also the saying, don't let a good disaster go to waste. So these funds within the state revolving funds, they are at the scale that we really need for larger mitigation and recovery projects. Number 3, effective planning. So SRF loans, they're primarily going to capital projects, but they can fund projects that we identify in our other plans. So our watershed plans, our hazard mitigation plans, our comprehensive plans. And this encourages communities to integrate these plans and treat them as living documents. So 4, human capital. So I think partnerships can really be a good antidote to capacity challenges, and the state revolving funds are an available tool for partnership development. So pursuit of an SRF project that includes both point source and non-point source components that encourages collaboration among often siloed decision makers and stakeholder collaboration, it's at the core of what we do as watershed professionals. So number 5, this really big reason here. So the bipartisan infrastructure law, as many have heard, there's a huge investment in water infrastructure through this law. $44 billion is being directed to the SRF over the next few years. Additionally, 49% of this is being allocated as grant funds. So now's really the time for us all to kind of, lift our heads up and start looking at state revolving funds. Some of the basics about state revolving funds here. So state revolving funds, I'm going to start saying SRF because I think we get the acronym now. So these are low interest loans, meaning you're going to get a lower loan rate than you would if you walked up to the bank and you asked for the market rate. They are revolving, meaning that the money gets paid back and reused. There's subsidies, meaning that there are grants, there's lower interest rates, and essentially what we like to consider, free money tacked on for certain projects and communities. Often these are related to disadvantaged criteria, but there's some other options in there as well. So these were established by the Environmental Protection Agency to address public health and environmental priorities. There's 2 different programs, just so you know. We've got the Drinking Water SRF, which funds drinking water projects, and then we've got the Clean Water SRF, and that's what I'm predominantly focused on, because the Clean Water SRF funds wastewater, stormwater, as well as non-point source projects, which is what we really care about. These programs are managed by states. Every state is different, period. Okay, and then the importance here, one of the big things to know about, so this is the largest source of federal funds for water infrastructure, and they have the potential to be the largest investor mechanism in the world for nature-based solutions. So we really care about that. Basics of how this money moves. So funding through the federal budget every year is allocated to the EPA, but then allocates to the states, similar to how 319 funds move. States are required to put a 20% match. Then states managing these programs, they provide these loans, they contract out to the borrowers, and then as the borrowers pay back those funds, it all kind of gets recycled back in. Eligible projects. So most of us know that the SRF are funding drinking water and wastewater. In fact, most of the people I talk to, and if you started talking about these, they'll probably tell you that, oh, those are the drinking water and wastewater funds, right? Because that's what they mostly go towards. But it's really important to know that there are a wide variety of projects that are eligible through the SRF. So again, most of these funds, as we know, they're going to what we call traditional projects or point source projects. That's through what's considered publicly owned treatment work, which for our case, we can just consider wastewater utilities. So predominantly to construction of wastewater utilities, as well as other related activities. But on the non-traditional project side, so it does include some point source, as well as some non-point source and nature-based solutions, which is what we're looking at. There's a ton of opportunity. So we can look at funding the same eligibilities as we fund through our 319 project. We've also got the 320 project, which is the National Estuary Program. We've got decentralized wastewater systems, so septic, that's a big opportunity, as well as stormwater and watershed pilot projects. Okay, so paying for nature-based solutions projects with the Clean Water SRF. I'm going to go a little bit deeper here. So again, I'm assuming most people here are likely a bit more familiar with 319 grants and what they can fund. This Venn diagram shows the overlap. So here we can see that the Clean Water SRF can fund pretty much all 319 eligibilities on the ground projects. The exceptions we have are it's not going to fund our watershed coordinators or monitoring or any other kind of non-on the ground project management that we use 319 funds for. But Clean Water SRF also funds all of the MS4 and stormwater projects, as well as wastewater utility projects. The other thing to know, which kind of blew my mind when I learned this, so I want to make sure to point it out, is that there is potential play between the Clean Water SRF and 319 in terms of providing non-federal match. So once those funds are paid back through the SRF, they lose their federal designation and they could be an option for non-federal match for those applying to 319 grants. So it's something you might want to ask your state about, because I couldn't tell you one way or another what states do, but I do know it is an option and it is worth asking about. So something else to be aware of is the Green Project Reserve. So this also applies to every state. States are required to put 10% of their federal allocation to Green Project Reserve or GPR. And this includes what I like to describe as 4 different buckets. So we have our green infrastructure bucket, we've got water efficiency, we've got energy efficiency, and then this environmentally innovative activities bucket here. Most states are meeting their 10% requirement with the water and energy efficiency. A good example I like to use, if a wastewater utility is updating a pump and that pump uses less electricity, then they can tie that to Green Project Reserve because of that efficiency there. Here's kind of a general list of what projects qualify as green infrastructure. Just for your knowledge, State Revolving Fund uses the term green infrastructure, which for our context on the watershed side is really synonymous with nature-based solutions. The other thing to note is that states are also allowed to direct their subsidy or essentially free money to the Green Project Reserve eligible projects if they chose to do so. So even though the Clean Water State Revolving Fund has the potential to support a wide variety of non-point source work, so far only about 4% of these funds have actually gone to these projects. There are several reasons for this. Some of the main ones and common barriers are really the autonomy that each state has sort of inadvertently puts up a lot of barriers for the non-point source projects to come through in applications, as well as to be ranked high enough to receive loan funds. There's a perceived lack of demand at the state level for funding non-point source projects. So we kind of have this chicken and egg scenario where if states don't see the demand, they have no incentive to really remove the barriers. And then if those with projects on the ground don't see a path to funding, they're not going to apply. There's also generally like a widespread lack of understanding around the benefits of non-point source projects and how to implement them, as well as how to maintain them, which I'm sure a lot of us have experienced in our localities. Overall, there's just a really huge disconnect between the non-point source and the point source side. Most resources are put towards point source regulation, while we know that non-point sources in most areas are having an overall greater impact. Some basics to be aware of. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but some common logistics to understand as far as when looking at your state, the barriers and possibilities. You can look at the guidance for your state to sort of get a sense for what your state offers if this isn't something you know about yet. So logistics I'd recommend to look into. One would be eligible borrowers. Most restrictive is where states are really going to limit borrowers to public government and public entities, and this is where it's fairly limited to utilities. Least restrictive is where you open it up to private entities, conservation groups, nonprofit groups, and other eligibilities that are allowed at the federal level. We have additional subsidies, so that either kind of grant money, lower interest that's allowed. Some states don't have any additional subsidy if you're doing a green infrastructure or nature-based solution project. Some states do. A third thing here is looking to see if your state has any pilot or other special projects. So similar to subsidies, some states don't have anything, which is going to be a bit more restrictive, and some states have really kind of special pilot projects or special project categories that really indicate they want non-point source projects to be applying, and they provide better guidance and direction for that. Application ranking. So some states aren't really going to have any additional points if you're adding in these types of projects. Some states actually provide more incentive, which can make a real difference and be incentive to those who are applying if they're going to kind of get a notch up on some of the other applications by adding in a green infrastructure or non-point source project. Okay, so it's important to understand that regardless of what your state is doing, this is set in policy, and policy can be changed if the right levers are pushed. A few quick examples here just to try to ground this. Again, I mentioned that sometimes there's not even examples in your state to refer to. If we kind of look nationwide, there are quite a few more examples. So even if there's not something in your state, there's definitely examples. So a few of them are here. We've got Greenville, North Carolina. They used SRF for urban stormwater projects that included permeable pavers and bioretention cells, sand filters, and other kind of stormwater conveyance system, green infrastructure. The city of San Marcos, Texas, they used SRF to fund land conservation for purchasing land around the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone for source water protection. We've got Camden, New Jersey. They're really kind of top tier in terms of using SRF for this type of work. They've got a countywide nature-based solutions project where they're implementing rain gardens and permeable pavers all over the city. And on top of that, they've got a green jobs program, which isn't funded by SRF, but it's certainly a really great complement. Okay, so a roadmap to get started, kind of first step, if you're dipping your toes into this as non-point source professionals. So I'm first going to discuss steps to building ground level support. So one, familiarize yourself with the opportunity. I've done this just briefly today, but this gives you a good sense of where to get started. The basics, this is really a really good foundation. From there, digging into your state a little bit more and seeing what your state offers. 2, SRF education and outreach. Start talking to people about this, be willing to have those conversations and seeing, where there's interest, where there's pushback, but starting to talk on, your watershed conservation side with your watershed groups, your conservation districts, extension offices, what have you, all the way up to the state level. Sometimes the states are going to know, especially like the state agencies doing the non-point source work, they might already have plans or, ideas about how to build engagement around state revolving funds, and they might be really excited that you go to them and you let them know that you're interested in this. Supporting partnerships. So this is all about breaking down those silos between the point source and the non-point source work. Be part of those conversations, be willing to understand what the priorities are of the other side of those doing the point source work. Look for inroads, look for collaborations there. Help move this non-point source work that we know is so essential into planning and projects. So supporting development of projects is really key, whether you're interested in applying for state revolving funds or there's so much funding out there now. So really finding ways to build up projects, even if it's just a concept, is a really essential thing that I would recommend watershed and conservation groups look at right now. Like, what are your top priorities? Start to build what you have within the capacity that you have. From there, looking at your hazard mitigation planning, are you involved in that process? When is it happening? Try to be in those rooms. Same with the comprehensive plans. And then look at moving that into the capital projects. Again, the capital projects are really what utilities and municipalities are looking at when they're seeing where they want to apply for state revolving funds. Work towards getting those non-point source projects that are in our watershed plans, maybe in our hazard mitigation plans, then into the capital project plan. Big part of this, demonstrating demand. So supporting applications however you can in your position, advocating however you can in your position. That could be, promoting this, promoting the reasons, promoting justification, just standing up and raising your hand and saying, hey, I'm interested in this, let's have a conversation. That's kind of what gets the ball rolling, especially because so much of this decision making really happens at the local level. Looking at justification. So a big thing to understand is this isn't a one-way street. The utilities need you to be part of this. So on the conservation watershed side, you're helping develop projects, you're providing that education of why these projects are so important, where they're needed. There's the incentive part I mentioned, where those applying might get additional incentive via ranking or subsidy if they've got the non-point source work. These projects can help meet permits and consent decrees. That's a big one there. Talked about resilience and disaster recovery, thinking long term. If you're especially in a disaster prone area, you want to think about resilience and you want to think about nature-based solutions, and state revolving funds have the capacity to fund those projects. Long-term success, the state revolving funds do not fund ongoing operation and maintenance. That's where we really need the watershed groups and those who have, at least right now, volunteers to step up and help with long-term maintenance, because oftentimes municipalities just don't have the knowledge or capacity to do that. Hopefully we'll move in that direction, but we know we're just not there yet. And something to kind of convey here, this diffusion of innovation model, I think it's important just to understand that for most of our states, we're really in this kind of early adopter, or even maybe innovator stage. So you may be the only person in the room talking about state revolving funds or aware of this opportunity, but know we have to start somewhere and work towards kind of being a champion and creating a champion within your community, which then will help us get to, widespread acceptance. And my last slide here is just to let you know that if you're looking for more help, that myself, along with my team, we are funded right now in these various geographies to support those interested in applying for SRF for their nature-based solutions project. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you'd like to chat and learn more. And I'm sure you'll be getting my contact info, but here it is for now. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you so much, Becca.
Thank you.
Interesting questions are coming through the chat. So I encourage folks to put their questions for Becca in the chat, and we'll make sure and get time for those later on. But I want to move on to our second speaker today, which I mentioned is Jesse Womack. Jesse has worked at AmeriCorps Vista and also, most recently at the Nature Conservancy in Ohio, and now has moved over to the National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition, and is going to be talking a little bit about, so we talked a little bit about, when I think state revolving funds, I think more of the bipartisan infrastructure law, but let's now focus on IRA and see how that is impacting a lot of the conservation agriculture programs that we're familiar with in the area, as well as expanded opportunities for those. So excited, Jesse, to have you here. Thanks so much for being here.
Awesome. Thanks, Anne. Can everybody see my screen? Am I good to go?
Looks great.
Okay, cool. Well, as Anne said, I'm Jesse Womack. I cover conservation policy for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And I'm going to spend some time talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the Farm Bill. The two are pretty tightly intertwined. Hard to speak about one without the other. And just as a big qualifier on everything I'm about to say and the guesses I'm about to make, you know, I have a pretty unique vantage point at this point in my career, being a DC-based policy wonk, working to pass laws mostly. And I'm assuming a lot of you that do a lot more on the ground work, you know, have a pretty fine-tuned understanding of what is happening with the Inflation Reduction Act rollout as well that I'm not privy to. So I'm going to give you a couple big takeaways on this funding that I think I understand from my vantage point, but really looking forward to discussion and additional nuance coming from all of you in the community where these funds are currently touching down. A little bit of extra context about who NSAC is. We're a grassroots alliance of over 145 member organizations around the country. This slide is a bit outdated. Our member orgs are all different types of food systems organizations, research institutions, farmer member organizations, just food system advocacy groups, tons of different folks, all of whom collectively work to advance sustainable ag policy at the federal level. I'm their paid lobbyist. I hang out in DC all day and try to turn their dreams into laws and get them passed in the Farm Bill every 5 years. So what is the Farm Bill and what is its relationship to the Inflation Reduction Act? The Farm Bill is one of the biggest pieces of agricultural and food systems policy that we have in the United States today. It's a massive omnibus piece of legislation, well over 1,000 pages long, authorizes dozens, if not hundreds of programs, as well as billions of dollars of spending over its 5-year kind of working window. We can see a rough breakdown of all the things the Farm Bill covers here. The modern Farm Bill has about 12 titles. There's always a chance that this will change, but these were the 12 titles passed in the 2018 Farm Bill. Of particular interest today is that Title II, Conservation bucket. And here we have a quick breakdown of how much funding just from the Farm Bill roughly falls into all of these individual titles. You'll see conservation there in blue coming in at about $29.6 billion authorized for the 5-year life of the 2018 Farm Bill. So that's really the baseline funding available for the individual conservation programs that IRA then invested in and on top of. Digging a little deeper, what does that spending look like inside that conservation bucket? You can see here a breakdown of what was authorized for each fiscal year inside some of the major conservation programs in Title II of the Farm Bill. We have the Conservation Stewardship Program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. These are all Farm Bill programs that received IRA funding, but it's worth noting that this is not an exhaustive list of those conservation programs funded by the Farm Bill, just focusing on these today and providing their sort of baseline funding as context for all the programs that IRA actually touched when its investments were made. So yeah, year by year, this is what we had to operate with after 2018. And I do also think it's really important to note that while these are some pretty big numbers for each program, it was nowhere near enough funding. Since the 2018 Farm Bill passed, we've pretty consistently seen only about 25% of farmers applying to EQIP and CSP in particular able to secure contracts in any given fiscal year. So to me, that says IRA was very much needed. An infusion of cash for these programs is really important. Yeah, pretty major victory. If we skip ahead and look at what kind of funding the IRA actually provided, this slide shows all of that money on a program by program basis, as well as broken out by each fiscal year. That's going to be a little bit important later on as we start talking about near and short-term changes to IRA in relation to the Farm Bill. But this gives you a quick sense of when that law was passed, how much money was going to be made available to these programs, all of which provide direct financial support for the implementation of conservation practices on the ground. And all of these programs have the ability to fund practices that can improve water quality on the landscape. Something else that's really important to understand about this money in this slide, all of these IRA dollars are considered appropriated. Whereas the previous slide was Farm Bill baseline funding provided for those for these programs, that's mandatory money that really can't go anywhere. This appropriated money through IRA is more or less a one-time cash infusion for these programs. If Congress takes no additional action, this money will be given out to NRCS each year on the schedule noted, and then NRCS will have until 2031 to spend down those funds. After that, there's currently no plan to maintain these increased levels of spending. So without further action to Congress, there will be a pretty huge funding cliff at the end of the IRA's implementation window, which again stretches to 2031. So that is one scenario to keep in mind, that if we don't see further action from Congress, IRA is kind of a flash in the pan, and therefore to maximize these dollars, we got to make sure we promote the hell out of them and get producers applying. I don't think that's the most likely scenario. I'm going to cover that a little bit later, but it is a scenario to have in mind as far as the durability of this funding opportunity. And my first big takeaway after summarizing both those two slides is just there's more money available for these conservation programs than probably any time in the last 2 decades plus. The IRAs, even in a one-time cash infusion kind of sense, it's a big increase over baseline spending, and it really makes it creates a large opportunity right now for folks to enroll in these programs. So we talked about the total amount of funding available, but there's another reality here as well, and that is that the IRA had some targeting language associated with it. So that means these dollars can't be treated the same way as baseline dollars flowing into conservation programs. They have to go to a specific purpose. That purpose was laid out in statute, and I've copied out the language here. Just an example of the targeting language for CSP funds that passed in IRA. And long story short, these dollars have to mitigate greenhouse gases in some way, shape, or form, and NRCS has to prove that they do in order to spend these dollars. And we very much have a sense of what NRCS thinks will do that. Many of you may have seen this list already, but this was the published list of climate smart agriculture and forestry mitigation activities for FY23. This is everything that NRCS currently does and currently compensates farmers for that it believes meet that charge given to them by Congress, and therefore this published list is everything that IRA dollars can flow to. There's been a lot of political concern about whether or not key practices are going to be ignored when this funding is implemented. And for example, whether or not water quality work will sort of be ignored or sidelined or some such thing with the implementation of IRA. But I think there's quite a bit to be hopeful about when we look at this actual list of practices they plan to fund. Yeah, and just a note on sort of the structure at NRCS that we kind of understand this IRA funding to have created. There's essentially 2 big funding pools available now. IRA funding that goes to this list of activities, and Farm Bill baseline funding, which goes to all conservation activities that would normally be allowable expenses under EQIP, CSP, RCPP. So that very much means all normal water quality work can still be done with mandatory Farm Bill money, which is awesome. And a huge win for water quality to see that capacity at NRCS preserved and this new additional pot of money created. But we've had, again, some folks kind of concerned that IRA funding would be too prescriptive and we wouldn't see the kind of gains we would like to on other resource concerns such as water quality. But yeah, I don't think that's really the case. Here I've pulled a couple example practices from this Climate Smart Ag Forestry list that explicitly improve water quality outcomes on farms. Field borders, filter strips, grass waterways, nutrient management planning, riparian herbaceous cover or forest buffers, and then the paired CSP enhancements on the far right there, many of which explicitly are about reducing nutrient loss to waterways. These are all eligible for IRA funding. And they're all practices that can be funded through standard Farm Bill baseline funding to these conservation programs. So IRA funding can very much be used to address water quality on farms. Farmers can use IRA dollars to implement everything on this list. And there's plenty of other things on this list that definitely have co-benefits. I just tried to grab a snippet of things that were a little more explicitly water quality and a little less top of mind for folks as potential climate mitigation practices to make the point that IRA is a huge opportunity for water quality improvement on the landscape. That sort of brings me to my next takeaway, which I really stated already, but the combination of IRA dollars and Farm Bill baseline dollars means there's more support for water quality practice implementation specifically than there probably ever has been at NRCS, which is really, really awesome. But again, with no further action from Congress, this is kind of a flash in the pan moment. However, we're pretty sure there is going to be some action from Congress because it is time to reauthorize the Farm Bill. Our current Farm Bill expires on September 30th of this year, which means those baseline dollars for each individual program, those are up for renegotiation. There is, in theory, some renegotiation that can happen around IRA itself. So it's not super likely that we will be looking at explicitly a flash in the pan as far as this funding opportunity. These are the individuals in Congress that hold the greatest power for reauthorizing the Farm Bill. You have the Senate Ag Committee Chair and Ranking Member on the left there, Debbie Stabenow and John Bozeman, and on the right, the House Ag Committee Chair and Ranking Members G.T. Thompson and David Scott. Each chamber has already begun drafting their version of the Farm Bill. They will almost certainly not finish and pass a new Farm Bill before September 30th. If you're checking your calendars closely, that is very, very soon. We have not seen a published version of either bill yet. So it's almost for sure not going to happen on time, which means we're likely looking at an extension of the Farm Bill this September. And that means our third big takeaway is near term, if the Farm Bill is extended, NRCS will likely have to spend down FY24 IRA funds as allocated. So there's a big opportunity to potentially put that flash in the pan, appropriated IRA funding into Farm Bill baseline permanently. But if we don't reauthorize the Farm Bill on time, we can't do that. So NRCS is going to have the very real, very immediate opportunity to spend IRA money allocated for FY24 this coming fiscal year. And just to give you a quick reiteration of how much money that is, throwing this slide back up, that means this coming fiscal year, we're likely going to see $500 million in CSP funds, $1.75 billion in EQIP funds, $800 million in regional conservation partnership funds, and $200 million in ASEP funds go out the door on top of Farm Bill baseline funding in each of these programs. So again, that's a really huge opportunity to promote to producers that this is available, that this is a really really great year to apply to any of these programs. Yeah, something very much to keep your eyes on. And I also want to call everyone's attention to the RCPP number in particular here. You'll notice that's a pretty massive jump from 250 million up to 800 million for FY24. And this is, you know, seems even more massive when you consider the fact that for the last 5 years, there's only been $300 million of RCPP funding available each year through Farm Bill baseline. So this is a huge, huge, huge jump that we're looking at for FY24. Which brings me to my next big takeaway. There are going to be a lot of RCPP dollars out there near term. I know a lot of folks on this call probably have the opportunity to directly apply or to apply in coalition with others. So I really do think it's worth noting there will be either very large competitions, more competitions, or a combination of both over the next year as NRCS seeks to obligate this money. But they're very much going to have the opportunity and real political pressure to do so. So expect to see some RCPP postings beyond the one that's already out there. Turning back to the Farm Bill and these folks that have to write it, and also looking a little farther ahead, everybody on this slide and many other members of Congress already have stated goals around IRA and conservation funding in this upcoming Farm Bill reauthorization. Senator Stabenow, chair of the Senate Ag Committee, wants to keep as much IRA funding in conservation programs as she can, and also wants to keep climate targeting as a permanent part of those conservation programs. Rep. Thompson disagrees. He wants to minimize the Farm Bill's focus on climate change and use IRA dollars for other priorities, such as increasing reference prices in Title I commodity programs. This is a big deal because in order to pass a Farm Bill, these folks are going to have to come to an agreement, which means there will be a compromise that looks different than either party's preferred end goal. And no matter what that compromise is, it's going to change the nature of the IRA funding opportunity that's out there. And I think that takes me to my really final takeaway for you guys today. Given the strength of support Stabenow has from everyone I talked to in her position of maintaining this funding in conservation programs, I'm willing to bet there will be an increase in permanent baseline funding for conservation programs whenever this Farm Bill is reauthorized. Not sure how large it's going to be, not sure which programs will come out the farthest ahead, but we're likely moving into a future where there is more conservation money available in EQIP, CSP, RCPP, and ASA. It's possible that a permanent focus in climate change mitigation will be baked into those programs in some way, shape, or form, preserving that climate targeting in IRA, but it's a little less certain. Again, I think that's positive. We really hope at NSAC that we're able to make that happen. But whether it does or doesn't, NRCS will still maintain a ton of capacity to address water quality concerns explicitly, and both with climate money and regular baseline Farm Bill money, we'll have the ability to fund practices that improve water quality out on farms all around the country. So whatever the outcome, I think it's a massive opportunity for increased spending on water quality practices, and it's worth making producers aware of that. And I think that is my last slide, and here's my contact information. And yeah, really excited to get into questions and answers.
Great, thank you, Jesse. Spotlight's here. All right, great. Well, thank you so much for those great presentations. We do have some questions coming in, so we'll get right to them. I question first for Becca. Can the state revolving funds or 319 funds be used to fund a project in the planning stage?
100% 319, as long as it's not funding practices that would be required through any type of permitting. Typically, the overlap conflict comes with stormwater program. That's an easier one. State revolving fund, it varies by state. Some states do have the ability to include the project planning before the project is funded. Some states do not.
Great, thanks. And I know Don added in some response there. So I think this question would also probably go back to Becca in terms of the funding. How much is grant available? Because many groups can borrow but need some help with grant funds. I think that is a great point, Lamont, in that I think that's probably one of the bigger things that can hold you back from looking at state revolving funds when you are non-point source, is just that the kind of barrier of having to pay those funds back. You mentioned sometimes there are incentives, I know, and that, you know, in certain programs they lessen that.
Yeah, and again, the common answer is like so there's the theoretical, right, which is what I talked about mostly, is what's available on the federal level. It's going to vary based on the state, and that's why having kind of separate conversations to talk about what state you're in and what you're trying to do is sort of necessary in these situations. So there is subsidy, which is often given as a grant. Typically, that's put towards disadvantage criteria in each state. States can also put that towards other special categories, such as the Green Project Reserve, as I mentioned, which would include green infrastructure. Then there's different kind of set aside projects. You know, somebody mentioned in Wisconsin. I'd say that looking at this input from Mark Rydell, thanks for adding that. What Mark wrote is a really good example of how you just have to look at what your state offers. So it's going to vary state to state, and I'm going to sound like a broken record when I say that, but don't let that stop you from looking in deeper and seeing, you know, where there may actually be opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's at least worth having that conversation with your, you know, contact at the natural resources or at the state level to talk about what's going to make the most sense, and if any of it applies, how restrictive your state is, etc. Okay, some questions for Jesse here. Ed is curious if IRA funds go to national or state SIG funding.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do believe that there is an explicit carve out for EQIP SIG in the IRA authorizing text. I'm going to forget the total number, but I do believe it mandates like twice the amount of funding needs to go to SIG as normally would. So yeah, I'm really going to get the numbers wrong, but it's a big plus up. SIG is explicitly awarded more funding in IRA on top of its normal Farm Bill baseline money. Okay,
great. So you didn't cover that, but yeah, there is more money coming to SIG. That's good to know. And Ed has another question with it in terms of EQIP, you know, with it quadrupling in 2024. He's curious if you see like the farm site cap of 300K being upped appropriately or not. Obviously, you don't have the answers looking into the future. Look into your crystal ball and tell us. But is that something that you're hearing at all, with some way to, you know, spend down some of these very large amounts? I do understand. The amount that it is, and I've also heard, you know, Chief Crosby talk and say, like, we need help getting this money out, right? Like, I don't think NRCS is sitting on their hands at any way.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I will say that the payment limitations, the 5-year payment limitations per farm site, are authorized in base statute, and IRA did not waive them to my knowledge. So I believe the cap is something like 200K over 5 years for CSP and 450K over 5 years for EQIP. That is something that could be reevaluated in the Farm Bill. I would advocate it probably shouldn't be. I know that puts NRCS in a bind in terms of just how many contracts they have to write. But since we do all of our advocacy on behalf of small, historically underserved, diversified producers, we want to preserve their ability to be competitive in applying to these programs. And if we're giving NRCS the go-ahead to write really large infrastructure heavy projects with these conservation dollars, we lose a lot of ability to get money out on the landscape for making kind of in-field management style changes that increase diversity. So I think that's my hot take there.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And certainly there's two sides to every coin with that one. Absolutely. Mark has, I think, a little bit more of a comment in relation to Becca, your presentation. He's noting that in Wisconsin, we have to be careful about the language of BMPs or best management practices that are eligible, because in general, funds are hard or engineered practices. Ponds, waterways, treatment devices, definitely more structural practices that are edge of field, as opposed to soft practices he's noting here, in-field practices like covers, tillage, nutrient management planning. Do you know if that is common within other states, Becca, that you've seen?
Yes and no. So Wisconsin actually has one of the more developed SRF programs from the research that I've done. And they've got pilot projects for nutrient reductions. They've got separate projects for non-point source work. So if you're in Wisconsin, definitely check it out. But it's going to vary again based on different states. I think that a lot of states, they may be eligible for the more soft practices, and not have those restrictions, but they're also likely to be a state that hasn't actually doesn't actually have examples of paying for them and funding those loans, because based on those practices, they're not going to rank high enough, higher than the wastewater or drinking water practices to receive the funding.
Gotcha, that's helpful. And Mark did put some more information about Wisconsin's program in the Q&A, so I am leaving that up for folks who might want to look at that. Jane is curious. I think that this question is probably for you, Jesse, in terms of IRA and looking at those practices that qualify in terms of climate smart mitigation. Can these funds be used for removal of sediment buildup behind a dam? I don't know what NRCS practice code that would fall under.
Yeah, I'm scanning the list right now, and I really do not believe that that is going to be an eligible expense. Unless, there's some weird scenario where you're ripping down a dam to restore a wetland or something, but that seems like a very weird, not likely edge case.
Sure. I think it is always a good, example. We always talk about an extension, talking to your local extension agent. And I think it would be an example to talk to your local NRCS field staff about that. Obviously, I'm certainly speculating on that. And I don't want to make Jesse be the expert on that as a opposite proclaimed policy wonk in DC. So I do think that's really the question, and asking these questions if you have the needs, because there is a lot of money to put towards practices if you can, make them fit into the federal programs. Keely is curious to get slides. She's very curious, Jesse, your slides specifically. So maybe that's even a link that we can find too here on the programs applied to Climate Smart IRA dollars.
Yeah, I threw a link in the chat for all of the conservation practices that are eligible through NRCS. And if you go into your NRCS service center and say you're looking for cost share to do any one of those things, they should be able to steer folks to the right program. All
right, great. We'll go over to the chat there for that. I see we have, I don't see any additional questions in the chat, in the Q&A. So I'm going to take the opportunity in the last 5 minutes to ask Jesse a question of myself. Is that, can you speak at all to some of the expanded opportunities within RCPP with the additional dollars coming in? That's not something I personally know a lot about, but I do know, I have heard a lot about how these programs and what we traditionally think is going to be applicable is getting expanded with this infusion of dollars. So I was curious if you could speak to that at all.
Yeah, I guess I'd be curious what you're hearing. But other than knowing they're going to have to put out a lot of big competitions to spend this money, I haven't heard as much about like unique things that they're going to make sure they spend on. I will say it was sort of a necessary budgeting move within within authorizing all this new money for RCPP, that they had to lift the statutory cap on alternative funding arrangements that NRCS makes every year through RCPP. For those of you that are familiar, those are commonly called the AFA competitions in RCPP, and AFAs are typically more creative. They allow partner organizations to experiment with new practice standards or come up with new compensation schemes like, like water quality trading or carbon market pilot proof of concept type things, anywhere where you're compensating somebody like per unit, compensating them a dollar amount per unit of conservation outcome generated. Those are the kinds of things that usually happen inside of an AFA competition. And with that statutory cap lifted, there's probably going to be a lot more money put into those creative competitions, meaning, if you've got an off-the-wall idea about how to do conservation differently, and you've got a coalition of partners that agree with you, there's probably way more opportunity for you to get something off the ground than there has been previously.
Great. Well, thank you both for your time today and for those presentations. I really appreciate it. It's a great reminder to all of us. We have, as if we don't have water professionals enough going on, but it is a good reminder to reach out, have those conversations with our state point of contacts or our field office so that we do know what opportunities we have when we're working with our landowners. Okay, so thanks so much for being here today. I know we had a request for emails, so I want to make sure to provide that. Becca's email and Jesse's email is up on the screen in case you wanted to reach out and get some more information from them. This webinar will be recorded and we'll make sure to post it online. You can find that on our website at northcentralwater.org. And we will be back with you next month in September, September 13th, Wednesday, and we're going to be talking harmful algal blooms. We're going to be talking about harmful algal blooms a little bit beyond a look at nutrients, right? So that's something we all hear with HABs, but there are certainly other causes to HABs outside of phosphorus levels. So we're going to be looking at that. More information will be up on that on our website shortly, so be on the lookout. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.